The track had a problem in the third measure that nobody else had flagged. Wilfred heard it on the second listen, a ghost frequency in the lower register, the kind that didn't announce itself, that sat just below the threshold of conscious attention and made the whole mix feel vaguely wrong without any listener being able to say why. He pulled up the spectrograph and found it. Room tone bleed from the recording session, leaking through the low end like a stain. He isolated it and began the removal with the patient precision that was his primary professional skill, the capacity to hear what was wrong and quietly fix it before anyone had to notice it had been wrong in the first place. His phone buzzed on the corner of the board. He reached for it without stopping the playback. The message was from his director, Marco. Thursday session rescheduled. Client, moving it to next week. He was sorry. He knew Wilfred had been counting on the hours. Wilfred read this twice. He set the phone down and looked at the spectrograph and did not do the math immediately, because he already knew the math. The suppressants had come due on Monday, $43 until next Friday. The Thursday session would have been 32 of that. Now, it wasn't. He saved his work, wrote up his session notes, cleaned his headphones with the cloth from the left drawer. When these things were done, he put on his coat and walked out of the studio into the cold. The market quarter in late autumn smelled of roasting nuts and diesel and the mineral cold of a city preparing for winter. Wilfred walked the long route because the long route passed the pharmacy and the good bakery and the corner stall near the textile factory, and he had learned years ago that the best way to manage scarcity was to give yourself the pleasure of seeing things even when you couldn't buy them. He bought the bun at the corner stall. Meat and scallion, $4 food and warmth simultaneously, the kind of thing that was worth spending on when Dizzy was a professional liability and he had been ignoring his hunger since mid-morning. He had the bun in his hand and was thinking about the frequency problem in the third track when he turned the corner onto the factory side street and stopped. 3 men against the wall. Not unusual for this block, the factory had been closed for 4 years, and the street had accumulated the particular population of people that empty buildings attracted in cities that didn't look at them. What stopped him was the smell. Not illness, exactly the specific emptiness of people whose bodies had used up everything available and were now running on something grimmer, pack scent absent. Not neutral, erased. Like the city had been working to make them not exist. His omega biology, muted by the double dose he'd been on since the suppressants came due, registered the absence anyway. He looked at the bun in his hand. He looked at the 3 of them. The one in the middle looked up. Dark eyes, very still. Not defeated, that was the thing Wilfred noticed first. Alert in the way of someone who had kept their intelligence intact through everything the street could do, who tracked him with the specific attention of someone who had learned to read situations quickly. Wilfred crossed the street. He tore the bun into 3 pieces without ceremony, without speech, and held them out. None of them moved immediately. He waited. The middle one's hand came out first, large, scarred at the knuckles, trembling slightly with cold rather than performance. His fingers closed around the piece of bun with the careful restraint of someone who had decided not to take more than their portion. The one on the right took the second piece without looking up. The large one on the left took the third and said nothing, but his jaw tightened in the way jaws tightened when people were not going to say what they were feeling. Wilfred waited until all 3 were eating. He said, "Eat slowly if you can. It helps if you're really hungry." He said it the way someone said a thing they knew from experience. Then he turned and walked back the way he had come toward the studio, toward the $43, toward the frequency problem in the third track. He did not look back. He was already thinking about the low end of the track by the time he reached the corner. He went home that evening and ate rice from the emergency bag at the back of the cabinet and went to bed early because tired cost less than hungry, and he did not think about the 3 men on the wall again that night. The accounting was closed. He had done what he could do. That was always the whole of it. What Wilfred did not see, because he had already turned the corner. Kellen Voss set down the container of food he had been holding and did not pick it up again. He had been standing 10 feet behind the Omega near the stall queue, waiting for Rowley to finish arguing with the vendor about the sauce, which Rowley always argued about when the Omega turned the corner and stopped. Kellen had watched the stop, the look at the bun, the look at the 3 men. He had watched the Omega cross the street. He had watched him tear the bun into thirds. He had watched the giving of it matter of fact, without theater, as though the only remarkable thing was having to cross the street to do it and the waiting, and the single sentence about eating slowly, and then the turn and the walk away. The Omega had not looked back once. Rowley had gone quiet beside him. Kellen was aware of this, was aware of the quality of Rowley's silence, which was different from his ordinary silence, which was already quieter than most people's. Gabriel said, very quietly, to no one in particular, "Well?" Kellen watched the Omega reach the corner and turn out of sight. He said, "Who was that?" Neither of his brothers answered, which meant neither of them knew, which meant all three of them were going to be thinking about the same person for the rest of the evening, and probably longer. Rowley finally said, "He gave them his lunch." Kellen said, "I know." Rowley said it with the focused flatness of someone making sure a fact was correctly registered. That was his lunch. He bought it from the stall. I watched him pay for it. He said it with the focused flatness of someone making sure the fact was correctly registered. He had it in his hand for 40 seconds before he gave it away. Gabriel said nothing. He was still looking at the corner where the Omega had disappeared. Kellen picked up his food container and did not eat from it. He stood in the market quarter street with the cold coming down and thought about a man who had bought lunch, seen 3 people against a wall and given it away without breaking stride, who had not looked back, who had said times eat slowly if you can times in the tone of someone who knew from experience and had not made anything of the knowing. He thought, who does that without looking back? He thought, someone who has done it before. Someone for whom this is not a gesture but a habit, a practice so embedded it doesn't register as a decision. He said to his brothers, still looking at the corner, "I want to know who that was." Wilfred's suppressants were the industrial-grade formulation, the kind that registered as nothing even to trained alpha senses. He had been on them since he was 17, the year he understood what being an unregistered Omega in a city that noticed these things actually cost. Unregistered Omegas had no formal protections in the city's designation system, no legal recourse if an employer terminated them, no healthcare provisions under the city's secondary tier, no documentation if something went wrong in a way that required documentation. Registered Omegas had a paper trail that made certain things safer. They also had a paper trail that made certain things visible, and visibility had its own costs, and Wilfred had spent his adult life calculating which costs he could afford. The suppressants were the solution to the visibility problem. Double dose when finances were tight, which meant the expiration period shortened, which meant the cost cycled up faster, which was the self-defeating arithmetic of managing scarcity with a recurring expense. He had been running this cycle for 6 years. He was good at it. He was good at most things that required sustained attention and an ear for what was wrong. He had been running audio edits since he was 19, first for free, then for rates that crept upward as his reputation grew narrow but real. He knew the city's smaller studios, the ones that couldn't afford staff and used freelancers. And he knew their sound could identify a specific room's frequency signature the way a person identified a voice. He was not famous. He was not going to be famous. He was good at his work and he was careful with his money, and he had arranged his life to take up as little space as possible. And this arrangement worked. It worked with the specific precision of something that had no redundancy. It worked as long as Thursday sessions didn't get canceled and suppression costs didn't spike and the frequency problems in other people's tracks were things he could solve alone in a room. 4 days after the bun, Wilfred was outside the pharmacy on Reed Street, prescription in his bag, when someone said his name. He did not recognize the man immediately. He was about Wilfred's height, dark-haired, dressed in the kind of coat that cost more than Wilfred's week of groceries without appearing to. He was standing a deliberate distance away, not crowding the space, positioned with the specific care of someone who had thought about how not to startle a person. He said, "I'm sorry to approach you like this. I know it's unusual." Wilfred said, from a still position, "How do you know my name?" The man said, "I asked at the studio on Clement Street. Your director told me your schedule. I want to be honest with you. I've been looking for you since Tuesday." Wilfred looked at him. He said, "I don't know you." The man said, "No, we haven't met." He paused, and the pause had the quality of someone arriving at the sentence they had prepared. "My name is Gabriel Voss. I was standing behind you on Tuesday, outside the market stall on Reed Street. I saw what you did with the 3 men on the wall." The street went on doing what streets did. A delivery van moved past. Someone came out of the pharmacy behind Wilfred. Wilfred said, "I don't know what you mean." Gabriel said it simply, without judgment. "The bun. But you bought it and you gave it away. He said it without judgment, without the specific quality of someone who was about to make something out of it, just the fact. You didn't look back. Wilfred said, "That wasn't anything." Gabriel looked at him. "I know you think that." He said it simply, with no edge on it. "I disagree." Wilfred looked at him. He looked at the coat and the controlled quality of his attention and the way he was standing, the careful, deliberate non-crowding of someone who had decided to be here and had thought about how to do it without making it. Threatening. He said, "What do you want?" Gabriel said it without hedging. "To meet you. That's all it is right now." He held out a hand. "I'm not going to make this strange." It was already strange, Wilfred thought. But he shook the hand. They had coffee at the place on the corner because Wilfred was not going anywhere with a stranger and the place on the corner was public and he had somewhere to be in 40 minutes. Gabriel did not bring his brothers. Wilfred did not know there were brothers, yet did not know anything about Gabriel Voss except that he had been on the street on Tuesday and had found Wilfred through his director, which was its own kind of information about the kind of resources Gabriel Voss had access to. He said, "Why were you looking for me?" Gabriel held his cup. "Because I've been thinking about Tuesday since it happened and I wanted to understand it." He held his cup with the same deliberate care he applied to everything. "I wanted to meet the person who did that." Wilfred said, "I gave some food to 3 people who needed it." He said it in the flat arithmetic of someone who found the logic self-evident. It doesn't require understanding. Gabriel said, "Most people walk past them." Wilfred looked at the table. "I know." Gabriel looked at the table, including us. "Before you stopped, we walked past the same wall and didn't stop." He said it without self-exculpation, just the accurate record. "You stopped." Wilfred looked at the table. He said, "I had something to give. They didn't have anything. That's the whole of it." Gabriel looked at him. "Is it?" Wilfred said, "What else would it be?" Gabriel looked at him for a moment. He said, "I've spent 8 months in this city trying to understand the market quarter for an acquisition we're working on. We've commissioned reports, hired analysts, sent people to map the foot traffic and the social patterns and the economic pressures." He said it without apology, just the description of what had happened. "And then you turned a corner, and I understood more in 40 seconds than in 8 months of analysis." He paused. "Because you stopped, and we didn't. And what you did after you stopped told me more about what this neighborhood actually is than any report we've received." Wilfred said, "I don't know what that means for me." Gabriel said, "It means I wanted to meet you. That's genuinely all it is." He said it with the directness of someone who had decided that honesty was the only workable approach. "My brothers feel the same way. All 3 of us were there. All 3 of us have been thinking about Tuesday." He looked at Wilfred directly. "We'd like to know you, if you're willing. Something honest. Nothing you'd have to figure out the angle of." Wilfred sat with this. He thought about the $43. He thought about the bun and the 3 men and the thing he had done that he had already stopped thinking about because the accounting was closed and the closed accounting didn't need revisiting. He thought about a man who had gone from a street corner to his studio door to this coffee shop because he saw something and could not leave it alone. He said, "How do I know you're not making it into something it isn't?" Gabriel said it without flinching. "You don't yet." He said it without flinching. That's what the time is for. The second meeting was 4 days later, at a different coffee place. Gabriel, again, without his brothers, because Gabriel had understood that arriving with 3 people would feel like a presentation rather than a conversation, and a presentation was not what this required. He told Wilfred about Tuesday from their side. He told it plainly. Rowley's insistence on the street stall, the queue, the moment Kellen saw the Omega turn the corner and stop, the watching. What Rowley had said times, he had it in his hand for 40 seconds. What Kellen had said after. What Gabriel himself had felt, which he described with the precise vocabulary of someone who did not often describe feelings, but was doing so now because the situation required it. Like watching something I had been told didn't exist anymore, and finding out it did. Wilfred said, "What did you think didn't exist anymore?" Gabriel set down his cup. Generosity without calculation. Someone doing the right thing with no audience and no expectation and no pause to weigh it. He said it carefully. "We work in finance. We are surrounded by people who can calculate the return on every action before they take it. You didn't calculate." A pause. "Or if you did, The calculation came out differently than everyone else's. Wilfred said, I ran it. The numbers just came out different. Gabriel looked at him. He said, yes, that's exactly it. Wilfred looked at his coffee. He thought about what it meant that 3 people had been standing behind him and he had never known. He thought about times, eat slowly, if you can, times, and the feeling of the accounting closing task, completed, closed, no need to revisit, and now someone was telling him the accounting had been open this whole time, on the other side, in 3 people he had never met. He said, when you say your brothers want to meet me, Gabriel said it directly, I mean that they want to meet you the same way I did. Not as an event, just meeting someone. He said it with the directness he brought to everything. Kellen is the one who said we had to find you. Rowley is the one who went quiet on the street and hasn't entirely come back to his normal volume. They asked me to go first because I'm the most precise and they didn't want to overwhelm you. A beat, I'm telling you this so you know it's the 3 of us. Not a surprise. Wilfred said, I appreciate the warning. Gabriel said, with the dry quality of someone making an observation rather than a joke, I thought you might. The session at the studio happened 10 days after the pharmacy. Gabriel had asked, at the end of the second meeting, we're in the middle of an acquisition that includes a significant music catalog. There's a rights question on one of the pieces, a technical question about the recording quality and whether a particular issue affects the license value. Would you be willing to look at it? Wilfred said, that's a professional inquiry. Gabriel said, times, yes, times, simply. Wilfred said, you could have led with that. Gabriel looked at his coffee. I could have. It wouldn't have been honest about why I was there. He said it simply, I wanted to meet you first. The catalog question is real, but it wasn't the reason. Wilfred said he would look at the question. They came all 3 together, which was what Gabriel had promised, not a surprise. Kellen arrived first, which was apparently how Kellen operated ahead of schedule, already reading the room before the others were in it. He was taller than Gabriel, the composed attention of someone who processed information quickly and was currently processing the mixing booth, the spectrograph on Wilfred's screen, the session notes on the corner of the board, the particular organization of a person who was precise about their workspace. He said, Wilfred Times confirming a fact, Kellen Voss, a brief handshake, direct. I've been wanting to meet you since Tuesday. Wilfred said, Gabriel mentioned. Kellen said times good times in the tone of someone who found directness efficient. Rowley came in while Kellen was still finishing the sentence. He was the largest of them, and the stillest, not careful, still like Gabriel, but present still, the stillness of someone who occupied space without managing it. He looked at Wilfred with the open, direct attention of someone who had been waiting for this moment and was not going to pretend he hadn't. Rowley said it before anything else, you don't remember us. Wilfred said, I didn't know you were there. Rowley said, times, I know times, simply, without wait. That's the thing. Then Gabriel, closing the door behind him, and the 3 of them in the mixing booth, and Wilfred at his board, and the cedar and smoke scent of them that had been reaching him since Kellen walked in, and that his omega biology was registering with the directness of a thing that had stopped being managed. He noted this. He filed it under times later. He said, the catalog question. Kellen sat down and opened his folder. The catalog question was genuine. It was also a good question, the kind that required actual expertise to answer, that had arrived in the context of a real decision with real financial stakes. Wilfred answered it and found the answer led to a second question, which led to a longer conversation about the recording's technical history, about what restoration would require, about the specific issues in the older material, and how they would be addressed. He pulled up the spectrograph. He demonstrated the problem in the audio. He explained the approach he would use to fix it. Kellen asked follow-ups that were better than the original questions. He asked them with the focused attention of someone for whom information was a resource and who knew how to gather it, not performing engagement but actually engaged, asking the thing the previous answer had left unresolved. Rowley watched. He sat in the chair along the right wall and watched Wilfred work with the patient observational quality that Wilfred was beginning to understand was his primary mode, not passive watching, active cataloging. Gabriel asked one question at the end that cut to the structural principle. If the restoration approach you've described changes the character of the original recording, if it removes something authentic in order to produce something cleaner, is that a net gain or a net loss? Wilfred thought about this. Wilfred said, "Depends what you think the recording is for. If it's a document of a moment, you preserve the flaws. If it's a piece of music that needs to be heard, you clean it." He looked at the spectrograph. "This one needs to be heard. The flaws are getting in the way of the music." "I'd clean it." Gabriel said, "Good." He said it the way he said everything, as a fact that had been verified. At the end of the session, Rowley said, "Do you want the work? The full catalog?" Wilfred said, "What does full catalog mean?" Rowley laid it out. 732 tracks across 42 years. Restoration, format conversion, licensing preparation, 6 months, possibly more. Wilfred ran the math. The math came out clear and significant and changed the picture of the $43 considerably. He said, "I'd need to see the full scope." Kellen said, "Times, of course, times," in the tone of someone who had expected this and respected it. He said it in the tone of someone who had expected this and respected it. "We'll send the documentation tonight." They left. Wilfred sat in the mixing booth alone. He thought, 732 tracks. He thought, 6 months. He thought about the bun and the 3 men on the wall, and Gabriel saying times the calculation came out differently than everyone else's. And he thought about whether accepting work from people who had watched him give his food away was the same as being paid for giving his food away. He decided it was not the same. The work was real, the rate was fair, the catalog needed doing, and he was the person who could do it. He thought, for a long time, about times I wanted to meet you. That's all it is right now. He went home. He ate. He did not run the other accounting yet, the one that was not about the catalog. He told himself he did not have enough information yet. He told himself this for 3 more days, which was how long it took to understand it was not about information. The catalog sessions became their own structure. Not every day the work didn't require their presence at every session, and Wilfred would not have wanted it if it had. He needed to be able to work, and he worked best when the room had the quality he wanted the room to have. But they came 2 or 3 times a week with the unpredictability of people who had their own schedules and were fitting themselves into his rather than organizing him around them, which suited him better than the alternative would have. Kellen came on mornings when his calendar allowed. He always brought coffee from the good place on 5th Street, always the right order. Not rounded up and not guessed, the specific thing Wilfred would have chosen, which meant someone had paid attention to what he ordered and remembered it. He asked questions about the restoration work with the focused patience of someone who had done reading before arriving and needed gaps filled rather than foundations laid. Wilfred answered and found, explaining that he understood his own decisions more clearly, that having to articulate the why of a choice required him to understand it more completely. This was unexpected. He was not used to being made to understand his work better by explaining it to someone else. Rowley came in the afternoons. He said less than his brothers and noticed more. He had identified the wobbly chair by the board on his 2nd visit, and it was not wobbly on the 3rd, which Wilfred discovered when he sat in it and ran a hand test and looked at Rowley, who was examining a photograph on the studio wall with the focused interest of someone making sure not to appear to be doing anything. Wilfred said thank you. Rowley said it had been making a sound when Wilfred shifted, left side, and the 3rd report to building maintenance had apparently worked. He said this to the photograph. Gabriel came in the evenings, sometimes alone, sometimes with Kellen. He did not make small talk. He sat on the bench along the right wall with whatever he was working on and occasionally looked up when Wilfred was making a decision that required attention. Not commenting, noting. On the 4th evening, he said, without preamble, "You made a different choice in the restoration on track 47 than you did on track 42. Same session." Wilfred turned from the spectrograph. 42 has more room noise in the low end. 47 recorded closer. Same approach would overprocess it. Gabriel said, "So, the difference is precision, not inconsistency." Wilfred said yes. Gabriel said times, good times, and went back to his work. Wilfred went back to his work and thought about the word times, good times, and what it meant that Gabriel had looked up from what he was doing, asked about a decision no one had flagged as wrong, and been satisfied by a precise answer. Not checking for errors, checking for understanding, making sure the picture was complete. The scent was always present in the sessions. Cedar and something cooler underneath, a layered composite distinct in each of them. Kellen's carrying the depth of something old, Rowley's warmer, Gabriel's sharpest. The kind of scent that registered as precision before it registered as warmth. Wilfred's suppressants were managing it. He was on the double dose for the first 2 weeks, which was more than the prescription allowed and which he had decided was a reasonable professional precaution. He noticed, by the end of the 3rd week, that the double dose was blurring his sessions at the edges. Not enough to affect the work, but enough that he could feel the slight dulling that came from managing something harder than it needed to be managed. His sleep was worse. His appetite, already not robust, had flattened further. He went back to the standard dose on a Tuesday morning without announcing it to anyone. He told himself this was about his health. It was about his health. It was also about the fact that managing the scent recognition had started to feel like managing the conclusion it was pointing toward, and he had been in this room with these 3 people for 3 weeks, and he had made certain observations, and the observations did not change based on dosage. He did not examine these observations yet. He filed them and waited. On the 31st day of the catalog work, the studio director called him in before his session. Sable Group had made an inquiry. The same catalog. A competing offer better than the current contract, Marco said. And he wasn't going to pretend otherwise. He was telling Wilfred because it was Wilfred's work, and because Sable Group was Voss Capital's primary rival in this acquisition, and Marco was aware that choosing Sable was not a neutral decision. Wilfred told his director to make whatever decision was right for the studio. He said it because it was not his business to make it, and because the right person to handle it was Marco, who understood the studio's interests and the city's financial landscape and the long-term implications. He said it and meant it. He did not tell Kellen. He told himself this was because it was not his place to tell Kellen. He told himself this for 2 days before he understood that the reason he was not telling Kellen was that he did not want to be the person who warned them. He did not want to be the person they needed. He was already too close to that, in the way of someone who had been careful their whole life about what they owed and was now in danger of caring about people who had not been careful about what they expected in return. Rowley found out through his own channels the triplets had sources Wilfred did not understand the scope of. He came to the studio alone on a Thursday afternoon and sat in the repaired chair and said nothing for a while. He said, "You knew." His voice was even, not accusatory, the specific flatness of someone who had already processed a thing before arriving. Wilfred saved his session file. He turned to face Rowley directly. He said times, "Yes." Rowley said, "You knew," and didn't say anything. Wilfred met it directly. "It wasn't mine to tell." Rowley looked at him. He said, "Fair." He said it the way someone said a thing that cost them to mean it, not easily, not with performance, but with the honesty of someone who had looked at the argument from the other side and found it held. He said, "Can I ask you something that isn't about the catalog?" Wilfred said yes. Rowley looked at him and asked why Wilfred worked so hard to stay invisible. The question landed the way direct questions landed from Rowley, not as an attack, but as an arrival. Something that had been traveling toward this moment for a while, and had finally reached it. Wilfred considered 3 different deflections and dismissed each one, because Rowley was looking at him with the patient, open attention of someone who had decided to wait for the real answer and would recognize anything else for what it was. Wilfred looked at him. Invisible is easier. Rowley held his eyes. Easier than what? Wilfred said, "Than being seen by people who want something from the seeing." Rowley sat with this. He did not say they were different. He turned the argument over and examined it with the attention he gave to things that required understanding, and then he said, "What do you think we want from it?" Wilfred looked at him. He said, "I don't know yet. That's the problem." Rowley left without fixing anything on the way out, which was its own kind of information. He said goodbye in the corridor with the directness of someone who was not finished with a conversation, only pausing it. Wilfred stood in the mixing booth and listened to his footsteps on the stairs. He thought, I don't want to be a good deed they couldn't leave alone. He thought about Tuesday and the bun and Times. Who was that? Times and Gabriel at the pharmacy and 31 days of sessions and the chair and the coffee order and the scent recognition that was now a fact he was no longer pretending was manageable. He thought about what it would mean if the thing was only about Tuesday. He thought about what it would mean if it wasn't. He went back to the frequency problem in the 3rd track, which was not going to solve itself, and held both thoughts at once, and did not yet know what to do with either of them. Gabriel was the one who said it. Not suddenly it arrived in the way things arrived with Gabriel. At the end of a long working session, with the city audible through the studio window, and the two of them alone, because Kellen had a call and Rowley was somewhere else. Wilfred was doing the final pass on track 47 when Gabriel looked up from his documents and said, "You changed your dosage." Wilfred kept working. He said, "Yes." Gabriel set down his documents. "When?" Wilfred said, 3 weeks ago. Gabriel said times why times with the economy of someone who had decided one word was enough. Wilfred said, "Because managing it was costing more than what I was managing it against." Gabriel was quiet for a moment. He said, "That's an accurate description." He said, "Of both things." Wilfred looked up from the spectrograph. Gabriel said, "The thing you were managing it against is us. I want to be accurate about that." He said it the way he said everything, as a fact that required no decoration, that was simply true and had been true for a while. All three of us felt it the day we were on the street. We had reasons not to say so immediately. You had reasons not to want to hear it. He paused. But it has been 4 weeks, and I think we are past the point where not saying it is a reasonable decision. Wilfred set down the headphones. He said, "I need to say something before you go further." Gabriel waited. Wilfred said, "I don't want to be a good deed you couldn't leave alone. I mean that precisely." He said it with the flat precision he gave to things that needed to be exact. "If this is about Tuesday, if what you're feeling is the attachment that comes from witnessing something and not being able to account for it, then I'm not what you're looking for. I'm a person. I'm not a symbol of what you think the market quarter is. I'm not a story about generosity that you needed to meet in person." He held Gabriel's gaze. "If I'm those things to you, I need to know now." Gabriel looked at him for a long moment. He said, "You're not." He said it with the specificity he brought to all true things, not reassurance, statement. "We looked for you because of what we saw. We kept coming back because of who you are. Those are two different things, and I want you to be clear on which one this is." He said, quietly, "Tuesday told us you existed. Everything since then is the reason." Wilfred looked at the mixing board. He thought about $43 and the bun and the closed accounting and times I ran it. The numbers just came out different. He thought about 3 men finding him and coming back, and the chair and the coffee order and the way the room had begun to smell like something he recognized without having a word for recognizing it. Wilfred said, "Come back tomorrow. Bring your brothers." Gabriel paused at the door. "They're outside." Wilfred closed his eyes briefly. He said, "Of course they are." He went and opened the studio door. They came back the next morning. Not at the start of a session. Wilfred had not scheduled anything, but at 9 o'clock with the coffee from 5th Street, 3 cups, the right orders for all of them, and the specific quality of people who had been outside for some time and were not going to say so. Wilfred let them in. He had spent the previous evening in the studio after they left, running the frequency problem in the 3rd track, which had resolved itself in the way problems resolved when you had other things in your head and the analytical part of your mind went quiet and the answer arrived without being summoned. He had written up the solution in his session notes, packed his equipment, walked home through the market quarter. He had passed the factory wall. He had looked at it and kept walking. He had not slept well, which was its own kind of information. They came in and stood in the mixing booth with the city visible through the window and the catalog open on the screen, and Wilfred said, "I said come back. I didn't say what for." Kellen said, "I know." He said it with the directness of someone who had decided not to circle the point. "We wanted to be here. That's the what for." Wilfred looked at the 3 of them. He thought about Tuesday. He thought about times, who was that times, and what it meant that 3 people had asked that question and had not been able to leave the asking unanswered. He thought about Gabriel at the pharmacy, the deliberate non-crowding, the hand held out. He thought about Rowley saying, "Times that's the thing," times with the weight of someone who had found something they did not know they had been looking for. He thought, these are people who saw something private and protected it instead of using it. He thought, I have not encountered that before. He said, "All right." He turned back to the catalog and the session began. What changed after the all right was not the surface of the sessions. The surface was the same. The restoration work, the questions, the coffee, the silences that were the right quality of silence. What changed was the quality of Wilfred's attention, the part of it he had been directing away from the 3 of them, maintaining the careful distance, which he now stopped directing away. He began to look. He had been looking all along in the peripheral way of someone cataloging information without deciding what to do with it. Now, he looked the way he looked at a track directly, without managing what he found. He found Kellen arrived ahead of schedule because Kellen could not work on something until he understood it, and the catalog was a thing he intended to understand. He asked better questions each session because each session's answers had generated better questions. This was the discipline of someone for whom learning was not performance but function. He found Rowley's mode of care was entirely physical and entirely unannounced. The chair had been the first evidence, and there had been more since a cable management problem in the studio's routing that had been causing a signal issue Wilfred had noted and deprioritized, resolved one morning without comment. A window that had been admitting a cold draft from the wrong angle, seated properly. Rowley did not fix things to be thanked. He fixed them because they needed fixing, and he had hands and knew how to use them, and the fixing was so woven into his ordinary presence that it would have been easy to miss if you were not paying attention. Wilfred was paying attention. He found Gabriel's care operated at the level of principle rather than surface. He did not bring things, and he did not fix things. He asked the question that cut to the structural principle of whatever Wilfred was doing, not checking for errors, but checking for understanding, making sure the picture was complete. And he said things, occasionally, that landed with the weight of things that had been decided before they were said. Not declarations, observations, the kind that cost something to make. The scent, at standard dose, was doing what it did. Wilfred had stopped pretending it wasn't. The Sable situation resolved 10 days after Rowley's question. Marco told him Sable Group had withdrawn. The catalog contract remained with the studio. The circumstances were not specified. Wilfred did not ask Kellen what had happened, and Kellen did not tell him, unprompted. This was its own kind of understanding between them. Wilfred had not warned them and had given his reasons, and they had handled it through their own means and had not required him to know about it. The accounting was balanced. Gabriel mentioned it once, at the end of a session, in the tone of someone noting a fact they had considered from multiple angles. Gabriel said, "You could have lost us the contract." Wilfred said, "Times I know, times, once for the fact, once for the acknowledgement." Gabriel said, "You knew when it was happening." He said it with the evenness of someone laying out a sequence. Wilfred said, "Times I know, times, without defense, without apology." Gabriel set down his document. "I'm not criticizing the decision. I'm telling you I understand it." He closed his document. "You had your reasons, and they were consistent with who you are. That matters more to me than the outcome." Wilfred looked at him. Gabriel said, "We've had people around us for a long time who make every decision based on what it means for us. What we want, what we need, what protects our interests." He said it without bitterness, just the accurate description of a long-standing state of affairs. "You made a decision based on what was right. You didn't calculate us into it." He paused. "That is not a small thing." Wilfred said, "It was one contract." Gabriel looked at him. It wasn't about the contract. The room was quiet. Gabriel stood and gathered his things with the precise economy of movement he brought to all physical tasks. At the door, he paused. He said, "The thing about Tuesday, the bun." He did not look at Wilfred when he said this, just at the door, the middle distance. We had been in this city for 8 months. We had watched this neighborhood from every angle we could think of, and we had walked past that wall the same as everyone else. A beat. You stopped, because you couldn't walk past. Everyone else, including us, could. I've been thinking about what that means since Tuesday, and I think it means you run the numbers differently. Not better, necessarily. Just differently. He turned and looked at Wilfred. "And we would like to be around someone who runs the numbers differently. For as long as you'll allow it." He left. Wilfred sat in the mixing room for a long time. He thought, "I ran it, the numbers just came out different." He thought about what Gabriel had said, not better, necessarily, just differently, and the specific honesty of times, not better, the refusal to make the Tuesday moment into something larger than it was, while also not letting it be smaller. He thought about the factory wall and the 3 men and the bun and how none of it had felt like a decision. It had felt like the only available response to a specific situation. The way a frequency problem had one solution, not the most impressive solution, just the one that fit. He thought, maybe that's all it was. Maybe that's enough. There was a Tuesday in the 5th week when Wilfred arrived at the studio to find the mixing board had developed a problem overnight. A ground loop 60-cycle hum sitting in the monitoring chain. Not dramatic, the kind of thing a less attentive engineer might have attributed to the building's electrical system and ignored. Wilfred heard it in the first bar of the first track and could not let it go. He found the console's routing panel and got underneath it with his diagnostic tools. Kellen arrived at 9:30 to find Wilfred under the desk. He said, from the doorway, "You're under the desk." Wilfred said from under the desk, "There's a ground loop in the monitoring chain. I'm tracing it." There was a pause. Then the sound of Kellen sitting down on the floor on the other side of the console, the controlled movement of someone who had decided to do this as a deliberate choice and was doing it without ceremony. From the other side of the console, Kellen said, "What does a ground loop sound like?" Wilfred kept working. 60 cycles. A hum that sits just below obvious, like a thought you can't quite finish. Kellen considered this. He said, "How do you hear things other people don't?" Wilfred found the cable junction he had been looking for. He tested it. The hum dropped. He found the ground issue, marked it, began the correction. He said, "I've been listening to things nobody thought were worth hearing for a long time. You get good at it." He said it about audio. He understood as the sentence went out, saying something else, and the sentence had gone out before he could manage the implication. Kellen was quiet. Then he said, "That morning on the street, you stopped because you heard something." Wilfred came out from under the console and sat on the floor with his back against it. Kellen was across from him, knees up, arms on his knees, looking at Wilfred with the full directed attention of a man actively working to understand something. "Pie." Wilfred came out from under the console and sat with his back against it. They smelled like nothing. Most people don't register that. I did. Kellen said, "What does nothing smell like?" Wilfred thought about how to answer this. He said, "Like the city trying very hard to make something not exist. Like a thing that's been erased." He looked at his hands. "I know what that smells like. I've been careful my whole life about being the kind of thing that gets erased." The room was quiet in the way mixing rooms were quiet. Kellen said it with the weight of someone arriving at the last piece of the picture. "The suppressants." Wilfred said, "Yes, since I was 17. Unregistered. This city does things to unregistered omegas when they smell like themselves." He said this plainly, without making it large. A fact about his life, documented and managed for 6 years, and he was stating it because Kellen had asked, and Kellen was someone who received accurate information accurately. Kellen looked at him for a long time. Kellen said, "We didn't know." Wilfred looked at him. "No, why would you?" Kellen said, "I would have wanted to know." He said it carefully, with the precision of someone distinguishing between two different kinds of wanting, not to change what we're doing. Just to know. Wilfred said, "Why?" Kellen's voice had the controlled quality of someone managing something they did not often manage in front of others. "Because it changes what the bun cost." His voice was even, but underneath it was something he was managing with the controlled effort of someone who did not often manage things in front of other people. "I already knew it cost something real. I didn't know it cost that real." They sat on the floor of the mixing booth for a while longer. Neither of them moved to stand up. Outside, the city did what it did. The ground loop hum was gone from the monitoring chain. Wilfred got up eventually and went back to work. Kellen stayed for the whole session. The catalog was in its last month when the acquisition closed. The closing was on a Thursday. Kellen texted to say, "So brief, factual, the documentation complete." Wilfred read the text in the studio and understood what it meant. The practical reason for the sessions was finished. They could go. He kept working. They did not go. They came on Friday, the same as always, with the coffee and the questions and Rowley in the repaired chair. They came on the following Monday and the Wednesday after that. Wilfred waited for the visits to stop, and they did not stop. And the not stopping was its own kind of information, cleaner than anything they could have said about it, because it was not a statement but a fact. By the end of the first week after the acquisition closed, Wilfred had stopped waiting for the visits to stop. He had dropped his suppressants to the standard dose in the 4th week and had not gone back up. The sessions now had the quality they had always had under the surface, the cedar and smoke scent present and acknowledged, at least internally, doing what it had been doing since the day on the street when Wilfred had crossed to the factory wall and come back and not known that 3 people were watching. His Omega biology had known before he did. He had been managing it for 5 weeks. He was done managing it. On a Friday evening, with the catalog restoration complete and the acquisition closed and no practical reason for anyone to be in the mixing booth, Wilfred was doing the final quality pass on the last track when Rowley said, "What are you thinking?" Wilfred said that the restoration on track 732 is clean. He took off the headphones and set them on the board. And that I've been running an accounting since the day Gabriel found me at the pharmacy, and I have enough information now. Rowley looked at him. Rowley said, "What does the accounting say?" Wilfred set down the headphones. "That you were watching me on Tuesday and you didn't use it? You could have. You had my name from the studio. You had resources I can't access. You could have made the whole thing into an obligation and you didn't." He said it with the flat precision he gave to things that required accuracy. "You found me and you were honest about finding me and you let me set the pace." He looked at the 3 of them, Kellen by the window, Rowley in the chair, Gabriel on the bench with his documents. "That's what the accounting says." Kellen said, "And what do you want to do with that?" Wilfred said, "I want to say something first." They waited. They waited. He said, "I gave away the bun because I couldn't walk past. That's the whole of it. I wasn't performing anything. I wasn't making a statement. I had a thing, and they didn't have anything, and the only available response was to give it to them." He said it the way he said things that needed to be exact. "I would do it again tomorrow. I would do it to 3 different people on the same wall and not think twice." He paused. "And I don't want what's happening between us to rest on that. I don't want to be the version of myself you saw on Tuesday. I want to be the version of myself you've been in this room with for 5 weeks." Kellen said, "Those are the same person." Wilfred looked at his hands. "I know. I'm saying I don't want Tuesday to be the reason." Gabriel said it with the certainty of someone who had made this distinction a long time ago. "It isn't." He said it with the certainty of someone who had made this distinction a long time ago and was prepared for the question. "Tuesday is where we started. What you are is why we stayed." Wilfred looked at him. He thought about 5 weeks of sessions. He thought about the coffee order and the chair and the ground loop and Kellen on the floor of the mixing booth asking what a 60-cycle hum sounded like. He thought about times the numbers came out different times and times "I know you think that and I disagree" times, and the specific quality of being watched, doing something private, and having the watching be careful rather than extractive. He thought, "I have been running this accounting for 5 weeks, and the answer is not about Tuesday. The answer is what comes after Tuesday, and what comes after Tuesday is here and has been here every day and is not leaving." He said, "All right." He said it the way someone said a word they had been carrying toward for a long time, not the times all right times of acceptance, but the times all right times of arrival. The hardest word, it turned out. Not because it was difficult to say, but because it meant he had stopped managing what it pointed toward and was letting it be true. Rowley exhaled. Not with relief, with the release of someone who had been holding something carefully for a long time and had finally been told they could put it down. Kellen looked at the window for a moment, then back at Wilfred, with the expression of a man who had prepared for multiple outcomes and had arrived at the preferred one. Gabriel said, "Good." He picked up his documents and set them aside, which meant the session was over, which meant the next thing was whatever came after sessions. The bond formed slowly, which was the correct pace. Not because Wilfred was uncertain he had done the accounting, and the accounting was clear, but because the accounting had been running while he was also managing other things, and now that he had stopped managing the conclusion, he needed time to simply be in the room with it. The 3 of them kept his pace without making the keeping into a performance. There was no sense of a timeline behind the scenes, no quality of impatience dressed as patience. They were simply present, at the pace he needed, for as long as he needed. Kellen handled things. This was not new. He had been handling things since the first session, in the quiet, systematic way of someone who identified what was required and arranged for it without announcement. What changed was that Wilfred stopped pretending not to notice. The coffee order had been right from the beginning. The supplier for the studio's replacement headphone cables, which had been on back order for 3 months, became available the week after the all right. The lease negotiation on Wilfred's studio space, which had been a low-grade source of anxiety for 6 months, resolved in Wilfred's favor in a way that Marco described as surprising, and Wilfred did not find surprising at all. He did not say anything about this to Kellen. Kellen did not say anything about it either. This was Wilfred had come to understand the language. Rowley continued to show up and continue to fix things, and the things he fixed became more personal as the weeks went on. Not the studio's equipment, but the cabinet hinge in Wilfred's apartment, kitchen. I noticed on the first evening Wilfred had them over for dinner and addressed silently while Wilfred was in the other room, the lamp that had been flickering for months. The specific sound the floor made when you crossed it in a certain way late at night, which Rowley located one Thursday and corrected with the quiet competence of someone who had identified an irritant and removed it. Wilfred said, the evening of the floor, "How long have you been planning to fix that?" Rowley said it like someone reporting when a thing began. "Since the first time I heard it." Wilfred said, "That was 3 weeks ago." Rowley said it simply, "I was waiting for the right evening." Wilfred looked at him. He thought about times I notice when things could be easier and aren't. He thought about the patience of someone who had seen a thing needed doing and had held it in their attention for 3 weeks, waiting for the right evening to do it. Wilfred said, "Thank you." Rowley picked up his tools. "You're welcome. There's a drawer in the kitchen that's going to start sticking in about 2 months. I'll come back for it." Wilfred said, "How do you know that?" Rowley didn't look up. "The wood's already swollen on one side. Give it a cold season." He looked at Wilfred, with the directness that was his primary mode. "I'll come back for it." Wilfred said, "All right." He said it in the smaller way this time, not the arrival, just the word, and it was enough. The bond completed on a Sunday evening 3 months after the all right, with the city doing its ordinary work outside the windows, and the studio quiet, and Wilfred at the board doing nothing in particular, except being in the room with the three of them. No ceremony, no event that could be pointed to later as the moment. Kellen first, with the structural certainty of someone who built things to last. Rowley second, with the warmth of a man who showed up and stayed and fixed the floor and would come back in 2 months for the drawer. Gabriel last, who said before anything else, "I want to make sure you're certain." And Wilfred said times, yes times, and Gabriel said times, good times, with the quality of a thing verified and settled. The bond settled. It settled the way the frequency problem had settled on the Tuesday of the ground loop, not with announcement, just the hum dropping out of the monitoring chain, the absence of the wrong thing making room for the right thing to be heard clearly. The cedar and smoke scent was no longer something Wilfred managed. It was simply there, the way the room temperature was there, the way the city outside was there, the way his own scent was there now that the suppressants were at the minimum dose, and the minimum dose was only about professional discretion and not about the other management. He sat at the board with the three of them and thought about Tuesday. He thought about it the way he thought about it now, not with the weight of the old accounting, the thing he had tried to close and found open on the other side. He thought about it with the clarity of something seen at the correct distance. He had given away the bun because he couldn't walk past. 3 men had been standing behind him and had seen it and had come looking for him because they could not let it rest. He had told Gabriel, "I don't want to be a good deed you couldn't leave alone." And Gabriel had said, "Tuesday told us you existed. Everything since then is the reason." He understood this now in the full way he had accepted it before he understood it. Tuesday had been the door. What they had been doing for 4 months, every session, every coffee order, every fixed cable and silenced floor, was the house. He had spent his whole life taking up as little space as possible because small cost less. He was not small anymore. The accounting was still running, it always would be. It was how he was built, but what it was accounting for had changed completely. He thought the numbers came out different. He thought they always did. 6 months later, in the late spring, he was walking home from the studio through the market quarter when he turned the corner onto the factory side street. A man sat against the wall. Wilfred stopped. He was not carrying anything he could give. His hands were empty. He thought about the shelter on Caldwell Street, the woman at the desk whose name was Terry, the address he had been keeping in his phone since the first time he had occasion to use it. He crossed the street. He sat down on the pavement beside the man, which startled him. Wilfred said, "Easy, not police." He did not have food. He said, "There's a shelter on Caldwell that has space on weeknights. The woman at the desk is named Terry. You can tell her Wilfred sent you." The man looked at him. He said, "Why are you doing this?" Wilfred said, Because I was close to here once. Not exactly here. Close enough. He heard Rowley's footsteps before he appeared around the corner, had learned the sound of all three of them, learned it the way he learned sounds that mattered, without trying. Rowley came around the corner and found Wilfred sitting on the pavement beside a stranger, and came across the street and crouched down next to him without asking anything, which was exactly the correct approach, which was Rowley's default approach to everything. Kellen and Gabriel came from the other direction because apparently all three of them had been coming to meet him. Wilfred was going to have something to say about this coordination later. Right now, he looked at the man and waited while the address settled into something the man might use. The man said, "Terry." Wilfred said, "Terry, Caldwell Street. Tell her Wilfred." The man stood. He looked at the four of them with the careful, assessing look of someone who had learned not to trust gatherings of people but was running his own accounting and finding it came out differently than expected. He nodded once and walked in the direction of Caldwell. Wilfred stood and brushed the dust from his coat. Kellen said, without preamble, "We were behind you again." Wilfred said, "I know." He had heard their footsteps, all three of them, from different directions. He had known they were coming. He had sat on the pavement beside a stranger anyway because the knowing hadn't changed anything about what needed to be done. Kellen said, "Does it bother you, being watched?" Wilfred thought about this, honestly. He said, "Not by you." He started walking and they fell into step beside him, Rowley's arm coming around his shoulders in the easy, solid way it did now, Gabriel on his other side. Kellen slightly ahead because that was how Kellen walked. "You can watch, just don't make it into something it isn't." Gabriel said, "What isn't it?" Wilfred kept walking. "Remarkable. I just can't walk past." He looked at the street, at the factory wall with the scaffold up on two sides now. The neighborhood changing in the slow way that neighborhoods changed when money arrived and the people already there didn't leave. I never could. I tried when I was younger. When the margins were tighter and the cost of stopping was higher, I couldn't do it then either. Rowley said, the arm still easy around his shoulders, "We know." Wilfred said, "I know you know." He thought about Tuesday. He thought about the bun and the closed accounting and going home to the rice at the back of the cabinet and going to bed early because tired cost less than hungry, and not thinking about the three men again because the accounting was closed. He thought, the accounting was never closed. He thought, I just couldn't see what it had opened. They walked home through the market quarter in the late spring evening, the four of them, the city doing its ordinary work around them. The scaffold on the factory caught the last light. The corner stall was closing up. The pharmacy was still open on Reed Street. Wilfred thought about the $43. He thought about the arithmetic of a Tuesday, what he had, what they didn't have, the only available response. He had never found a reason to revise that arithmetic because the arithmetic was not about the money. It had never been about the money. It was about the thing underneath the money, the thing that ran the calculation differently from everyone else's, the inability to walk past something that could be helped, even when the cost was real, even when the margin was $43 and 6 days and a bun. He still could not walk past. He did not want to. That, it turned out, was everything.